Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Global and National Security Institute Speaker Series, coming to you from the campus of the University of South Florida in Tampa. I'm Jim Cardoso. I'm the Senior Director for the Global and National Security Institute, joined today by Major General Retired Charles Dunlap. He's the Executive Director on the Center of Law, Ethics, and National Security at the Duke University School of Law. Major General Dunlap retired from the Air Force in 2010 after a distinguished 34-year career culminating as Deputy Judge Advocate General for the U.S. Air Force. His teaching, writing, and speaking focus on national security, law of armed conflict, the use of force under international law, civil-military relations, cyber war, air power, military justice, and ethical issues related to the practice of national security law. A lot of lightweight topics there, obviously. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today, Doc.
Well, Jim, I'd like to say thank you and the rest of the team here for inviting me. And this conference is magnificent, but I think what's even more impressive to me is what has been done so quickly here at the University of South Florida. And USF is really seizing the high ground in the integrated approach that they take to a wide variety of issues, marrying up the academics and the technicians with the practitioners, something that we don't often see in academia. And I really congratulate you, General McKenzie, and everyone else for putting together something that is really very impressive. And I think we're going to continue to see great things in the future.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. We have tried to accelerate and move quickly to realize a vision. Looking back over your biography, you have spent pretty much your entire adult life focused on the legal profession and some of those ethical implications that come with it. What was it that drew a young Charles Dunlap to the law?
Well, actually, the Vietnam War had something to do with it because when I was in college, there was the draft, and I wasn't very political, but I did join ROTC, and so I had a commitment. And I think like a lot of young people at that time, I thought I'd go in, I'd do my time, I'd get out, and I had no plans at that time to make a career of it. But like a lot of things, you get into it, you like the people, the mission is exciting, and I think it's, serving in the military, it's not for everybody, and people serve in the military in civilian and uniform capacities. But what I found is that it is important to be part of something that's larger than yourself. And you don't want to, I personally did not want to wake up when I'm my age and look back on my life and say, if I went to big law and thought, oh, I saved a big company a lot of taxes for the last 40 years. That's a good thing. It's an honorable thing. It makes our nation great, but it's not what I wanted. And so I really liked the people, and when I was younger, I liked the moving around because you could kind of reinvent yourself. You go to a new base and so forth, and it was always challenging. And it was and is one of those sorts of jobs where you don't really know what you're going to do when you go to work in the morning because something can happen in the world and change everything. So.
That's, I'll tell you what, looking at my own experience in the military as well, a lot of it reflects that, the experiences, the people. Like you said, even the moving, it can be sometimes a bit of a grind, but it's new experiences that you get to see different parts of the country and different parts of the world. I
did things that I would have never done if I'd stayed back in Philadelphia. I would have had a totally different life. And I'm not one of these people who say, oh, I won't change a thing. There's lots of things in life that you wish you kind of done differently. But overall, for me, it was the right decision.
So are you an Eagles fan?
I am not an Eagles fan because I don't keep up with pro sports. I'm so into Duke, and I'm kind of a big follower of college sports.
Oh, Duke's doing pretty well this year.
It is.
They're looking great.
We have season tickets, and we've had season tickets since the beginning during some seasons that were, shall we say, not as rewarding as others. And we occasionally get basketball tickets, which are, by the way, are a lot harder to get than you'd think.
I would imagine
even for faculty. There's no special thing for faculty. So.
Well, Duke, basketball's, but football's making their own name as well. I'll admit, I grew up in New Jersey, right across the river from Philadelphia, so I still remain an Eagles fan. So things are looking good. Even though I live in Tampa, I know I have some divided loyalties.
If I had to pick a pro team, it would be the Eagles. I'll say that.
Okay. Worst fans.
Although I was
They're the worst fans. They have the worst fans in the country.
I was a Tampa fan for a while when Tom Brady was here just because he's an old guy still succeeding, and
Yeah.
that
Which is
tends to
always
resonate with people of a certain age.
Old is I prefer the term seasoned. We're seasoned.
Okay.
So you spoke of you talked about our Tampa Summit that we're having right now, as this is being filmed, in September 2023, which talks about the future and ethics of uncrewed vehicles and autonomous warfare. When did you get first involved in drones? That's kind of the colloquial term, although in the Air Force we call them UAVs or even RPAs, remotely piloted aircraft. When did you first get involved in drones and the ethical implications with them?
Well, I did 2 assignments that really highlight. I was at U.S. Central Command as the Deputy Judge Advocate, Staff Judge Advocate, and then I was later at U.S. At 9th Air Force, U.S. CENTAF. And so and then at Headquarters Air Force as well. And it's just so interesting to hear today about the number of, circuits that they have in the Central Command area of operations compared to the beginning. And there was a lot of, I think, questioning of the technology back in the beginning. My original view was that it's just another airplane, and I think that still is true in a sense. But what I tell young lawyers and other people, what's really important these days is to understand the technology and understand how it's utilized and what it takes to make things happen. Because a lot of people think it's one guy sitting in one place just running the whole thing. Doesn't realize there's this whole architecture of communication.
Over 100 people.
Oh, yeah, at least 100
uh-huh.
people. In fact, I've seen, depending on what they're doing, it could go significantly higher than that. So you really have to understand that in order to give legal advice and recommendations. If you don't understand the technology, 2 bad things are going to happen. One, that the operators are going to ignore you because they figure that you don't know what the heck, I was going to use another term, what the heck you are talking about. And secondly, you really can't give the kind of advice that they need to have if you don't understand, what that technology is. And it comes down to very small things like how much fuel is left, because that means how much longer can they observe the target. Or what are the other demands, because somebody else might want that predator some other place. So that compresses time, which means that you have to make decisions quicker, and you don't always have the luxury of having all the data that you might ideally want. I think in situations, commanders never have all the data they want. It's almost impossible. So you have to make a measure of when is enough, and what other factors do you have to take into account. So I'd say the biggest difference from back then is that I like to think I've gotten a little bit more sophisticated understanding of what how the system works and what it can and can't do and the threats to it and its unique capabilities.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I remember, in the early 2000s when really they started proliferating our use of them and how we employed them as a younger officer, and reading some of your writings, and I won't say diatribes, but you had definitely had some opinions on that, which were, good discussions to have when you look at the implications of their operational use. And you sort of talked about that, but if maybe you could expand a little bit more. So if there's a young JAG that's getting into the business and looking to be involved with drones and autonomous warfare, especially as autonomous warfare is evolving now, how would they approach it differently, perhaps, than how you approached it?
Well, I think I would like to say that the younger people do have more technological knowledge, but that's not always the case. I think people, knowing what you don't know is probably good advice for a young person. They can, and a lot of it has to come, they have to invest themselves into learning about it, because it can be complicated, and there are things that, especially the limitations. Sometimes you watch a movie like Eye in the Sky, which I do recommend to a lot of people because everybody says, well, it's not really like that. Of course it's not really like that. It's Hollywood, but there are enough basic ideas in there that it's worth discussion. But it's kind of the backstory of, the challenges with some of these operations. And I think that that's, what people really need to invest themselves into understanding and doing this work. At the same time, I think what you have to be conscious of are the critics. And you have to go through their work with a lot of specificity, and you need to not only be conversant with the law, but also with the technology, because what I find is very often that the critics just don't really understand how the system really works. A little bit of that is bad on the government in that there sometimes isn't the transparency that should be there. But on the other hand, there are some things you really can't be totally transparent about because then you would, you're giving information to the enemy about the vulnerabilities of the system. So I think that, and it is the wave of the future. It's hard to believe, but it wasn't that many years ago that people were talking, we need to get rid of drones, these are horrible.
I remember, I remember.
That mixed metaphors, that drone has left the tarmac, because when people are looking at the Ukraine war and even the previous war in can't even say the name of the country, right above Turkey there, and Armenia.
Okay.
And I think that was the first hint that, wow, things have changed, because I think they took out like 200 Armenian tanks. And I hope I have the war right there. I think people start realizing, well, and this wasn't exactly what people were complaining about. I think in the academic world, one of the biggest concerns is, well, you're doing this in other countries like Yemen, outside of what they call conventional battle spaces. But my answer to that, by the way, is that, well, and they want to make it much harder to do it anywhere. I think one of the things people miss is you have to put your mind into the mind of the adversary. You might have a very well-intended idea, but you have to put your mind, how is the enemy going to turn this into something bad? So if you have these tougher rules for drone strikes outside of the conventional battle area, what do you think the enemy is going to do? He's going to metastasize his operations into areas where he knows it's going to be tough for you to strike them. I mean, that's just simple logic. And I do use the word drones. I fought the RPA battle for a couple of years, and then finally I surrendered their drones. It communicates better, especially with people And another point is that we have this announced policy that we're not going to conduct a strike if even one civilian casualty. Number one, that is not the law. That's not international law. But secondly, what does it invite the enemy to do? It invites the enemy to embed himself among civilians, exactly what the law of war doesn't want to happen. So you have well-intended ideas, but I think we need to do a little bit more red teaming of what an adversary is going to do with our policies, especially when they're out in the public like that.
Yes. I mean, so, when we first started, and I remember when drones, we'll just call them that, RPAs, what have you, when they first started, and as you talked about, they still are very much controlled by humans, with a host of people in the background. But now, and this is one of the things we're exploring at this conference, is they're moving towards greater and greater autonomy and not direct control at all times. And just to keep up with the speed of warfare, it's probably an operational necessity. I mean, but what do you see as some emerging ethical implications that go with that increased autonomy?
I think, Jim, you've hit on, and that's what is the brilliance of this particular conference, is they're, I think, kind of grappling on that issue, because the way drones are operated now, they depend on a lot of connectivity, and they depend a lot on satellites and so forth. And in the future, as General McKenzie indicated in his really brilliant opening remarks, is that we can't count on that. And so I think we're going to have to put more and more autonomy into UAVs, and that's, we talk about keeping meaningful human control. And originally, if you looked at the original DoD directive, I think you would read that and say, well, a human being is going to have to make the final decision to. And I think in the future, just because of necessity, the speed of warfare, the hyper war, you're going to have, the human will set the parameters, but the machine is going to have to be given a lot of leeway. There's a couple things that need to go into that. I think we have to have more sophisticated test beds to see how, especially if we get to the point of generative AI, and we may get there because our adversaries are going to go there. Generative AI involved in not just providing better decision quality information, which I think is almost a given, but actually put it in weapon systems, which we don't have now. As far as I know, we're not even building them, but we're going to have to think about them. And because even if you do a legal review of the system as it is, well, 10 minutes later, it's learned new stuff. So you're going to have to figure out, what the test bed looks like. And here's the good news in that. There are so many commercial applications like self-driving cars and so forth, and legal liability. I think that is going to, we're going to get stuff from the commercial sector that will help us to evaluate, especially generative AI systems. So that's the good news. This is not something we're going to have to invent completely on our own. I mean, it'll have to be modified so that we have a good test bed. And then I think, like anything else, we are going to have to accept that things won't always work as intended. Some of this will be a problem with the software, and others will be, the system overheat, things that have nothing to do with the basic architecture, but just or some piece of sand got into something and things went wrong. And so, unfortunately, we've created a little bit of a narrative in this country and in the West that is of perfection. And there's two parts of it. Some of it is our own fault because we've advertised the precision and so forth. Well, then you create in the public's mind that, oh my God, if something goes wrong, somebody needs to be held accountable. If somebody is evil, somebody did something wrong. Well, two answers to that is sometimes things just happen. And you don't want them to happen, but they do happen because human beings are involved, but also just technology breaks. There's a book out years ago. It's called The Revenge of Technology. Things can, because you don't always know exactly what's going to happen. But then the other part of it is we haven't done a good job at educating the public on what the law actually permits, and it's much more permissive than what our current rules are. For example, international law actually anticipates and tolerates civilian casualties as long as they aren't excessive in relation to what the commanders seek to accomplish. And the reason for that is obvious, and we kind of alluded to it earlier, that if it wasn't the rule, then adversaries would constantly be moving forward in a van completely surrounded by school children,
Yep.
And that's not what the law intends to do. But we've invited, through our messaging, a narrative that expects perfection, and I think that's a mistake. What we ought to do is, very clearly explain what the law is, very clearly explain what our attempts are to do better than what the law requires, but also make it very clear that things happen in combat. The chaos, and you can flip open your Clausewitz almost to any page, and he'll tell you all the things that can go wrong.
It's you say that, and absolutely right. The challenge, it seems, is broadcasting that messaging in such a way that it's received by a large enough audience to comprehend that, so that it seems like it's very difficult to break through the noise of just social media and just a lot of junk that's out there that doesn't really take into fact that the realities of what the law is and where the right and left limits actually are.
And Jim, this conference is grappling with another aspect that's going to make it even harder, and that's the ability of AI, especially generative AI. It's super empowering disinformation, and especially in the area of deep fakes, they can make very realistic films looking like we bombed a kindergarten. And we have to come up with very sophisticated counters to that. Number one, to understand, and be able to explain to the public what the adversary has done from a technological point of view, because there's a certain element of the public out there that wants to know that. And then I think from a practical point of view, we need to alert the public that, people are going to do this kind of stuff. So not everything you see, you can have all the restraints in place to make your combat as immaculate as possible, but it doesn't mean anything if the enemy is able to convince the public through the use of this super empowerment from AI to make them believe that you've actually done a lot of other things that you did not do. And,
Good. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. You've warned about this. You've warned. The term you used previously was just supercharging. Generative AI can supercharge disinformation and propaganda, and that could warrant some type of reevaluation of how generative AI is viewed within the context of the laws of war. So maybe expand on that a little bit. How the laws of war applies.
Think, the Pentagon has come out with this civilian harm mitigation response action plan, which I have a lot of concerns about, quite frankly. One of which is I don't think it emphasizes enough the threat that generative AI in the whole disinformation area, what the threat that it presents. And it doesn't seem to build that. It should be a specific part of the plan of how are we going to counter that. Because I think here's a real danger. I think we can have all these things that, and plans and processes and policies that require us to do more than what the law requires, with the idea that the only way to limit civilian casualties is somehow to limit or restrict the targeting options of the commander. When the reality is, especially if you look at the data from like Afghanistan, the vast majority of civilians who were killed by what they call anti-government elements, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. But it really didn't make much of an effect on the Afghan people. I mean, it didn't. We assume that everyone is going to turn against the person who does civilian casualties, but we didn't see that in Afghanistan, really, because there are 40 million Afghans and I think 200,000 Taliban eventually took over. I mean, that's not to say that it isn't a tragedy, but what it is to say is that sometimes it's better to kill the people who are doing most of the killing, to wit the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and so forth, even if some civilians are killed, because overall it will save civilian lives, because you're killing the source of most of the killing, but you have to be willing to accept a program or criticism.
Feedback is one word for it, but
feedback. That kind of underplayed what I mean.
That's such a difficult message to.
It is.
From a logical standpoint, I'm following you 100%, but it's a difficult message to be able to transmit that and have it understood and appreciated.
That's why we need to start. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and that's one of the concerns I have with the Pentagon's plan. They don't even seem to grasp that notion. It talks a lot about cognitive bias and confirmation bias. Well, they're almost in the same thing with their own theory, because their own theory, doesn't seem to occur to them that there's any other way of preventing or limiting civilian harm other than restricting strike options, when actually they need to think it through the other way. And if you do think it through the other way, then you've raised the other issue is, okay, we are going to start talking about this, because we need to educate the audiences that we care about that this is why we're doing it. And I also think that the whole idea of that, Secretary Austin talks a lot about, well, has strategic impact. I really think he's thinking in a counterinsurgency mode, winning hearts and minds, and let's put aside the question of whether that was actually effective. But it's not going to affect populations in Iran and China and North Korea and Russia if we engage them in large-scale combat operations, which we have to really be planning for. So we don't want to put a bureaucracy in place that makes it very complicated for the commander to use force based on policies that are more restrictive than what the law of armed conflict requires, because then the commander is going to be, she's going to have to deal with someone who is reacting faster, an adversary reacting faster, and that, I'd be thrilled if I could say, well, all those countries are at least going to obey the law of war. Well, we don't, no, that's not the case.
No, that's not the
but
case.
We also know that they're not going to have these other additional bureaucratic, inhibitions that I think are going to chill the ability of the commander to use force in a way that, most expeditiously brings it to a conclusion. And, so my advocacy is that be very careful about what I do beyond what the law of war requires. And just to clarify, I believe in strict adherence to the law of war. But what we're talking about here is policies, ROE, everything else that goes much beyond what the law would require.
So you would, in essence, not to boil it down, but just I'll throw this out there, and you can kind of discuss it or shoot it down. It's more that DoD is almost putting in place policy that's not really based on the law of war. It's it's based more on, I guess I'd say, the social ramifications and blowback that would come from employing weapons in such a way that there was civilian casualties, even though the law of war would justify it in that case.
Yeah, and I understand where they're coming from. We all want to limit civilian harm. Although I will say one thing, that Secretary Austin, this really surprised me, in his tasking talked about protecting innocent civilians. That's a very dangerous statement, because if it's heard by the soldier, she or he is going to think, well, I guess there's a category of innocent civilians and a category of guilty civilians, ergo, I'll figure out which one of those civilians is. And actually, the law of war doesn't make that distinction. They're all civilians. And some of the civilians that are entitled to protection under the law of war are pretty nasty, evil people. But they don't fit in the category of a military objective. So, and when you hear this coming from the Secretary of Defense, it really, that's what alerted me first to this whole plan and raised my concerns. Because I thought, wow, if they can't get that right, and you got to think that the darn letter went through, you know how the Pentagon works.
Wow. Dozens of levels of review and scrutinizing each word, I'm sure.
So, and then I think we have to not mirror image. We assume that if we just operate on the law of war and we do cause casualties, that those casualties will have this outsized effect. And we don't really know that. It depends upon the specifics of the area. But in no instance would I advocate anything less than a strict adherence to the law of war. But we can do that and still accomplish the mission. My concern is, are we handicapping and hobbling commanders in a way that we don't need to do?
Yeah. Yes, that is I guess even in this day of greater situational awareness on the battlefield too, it's even tougher for the commanders to operate in such a way that maybe they could be hindered. Again, you have to obey the laws of the laws of war. It's just a difficult operating environment out there.
It is, and I think one of the issues that I have is we ought to be simplifying the adherence to the law for commanders, because one of the things we're seeing coming out of the Ukraine, we're not going to have those huge command centers. They emit too much. They're huge targets, and the adversary is going to. So we're going to have this distributed. So we're going to have, more mission orders, which is a good thing. But you can't make it too complicated, and different approval levels and this bureaucratic process. I think you need to focus on the fundamentals of educating commanders who may have to make very important decisions without the benefit of 15 JAGs around them who may be arguing among themselves about particular things. And that's the other part of it, is that, you know, the law of war can be fairly general. And so there are different opinions. And the U.S. has views on the law of war that don't always match up with our allies. For example, we are not parties to Protocol 1 to the Geneva Convention, and just about all our allies are, because there are things in there that the U.S. doesn't believe are in our national interests. And so the issue is, some of them are what we call customary international law, so we have to obey it even though it's not in a treaty, but a lot of it isn't. And I think that you know, that's another challenge coming, because you know, the way our population reacts to things is different from the way allied populations may react to things, and so it's a complex environment. And that's another thing I would say to young JAGs. I talked about the importance of knowing the technology, but the fact of the matter is you have to be a student of world affairs. And I say world affairs because one thing we've learned in the last 20 years, you might go to bed thinking, okay, we're fighting in Syria, we're fighting in wherever, but you wake up and we're fighting someplace else. So you have to be a quick learner, and you have to be willing to operate in an environment of uncertainty.
So stepping back, maybe taking the 50,000-foot view, and as we look ahead, what are some of the main key areas we need to explore moving forward to really grapple with this topic as we've discussed over the last 30 minutes?
Jim, I think we've talked about a lot of them, but if I was to pick out one thing, is I think we need more centers like yours here, because what you're doing here is rather unique. You're marrying the military with the academic and also the commercial community, where a lot of the expertise in these particular areas relies. Military can't do it all. They're fighting today's battle. They can inform the needs and the realities, but I really congratulate the University of South Florida from having the vision to do something like this. And it'd be great to see centers like this proliferate. Even the University of South Florida can't do it all. We need other institutions doing these sorts of things. So that would be my, you know.
Well, we will do our part, that's for sure. We're going to continue to do our part.
Point.
And we hope to, hopefully, that you'll come back and visit us again as we continue to expand our vision on what we're seeking to do to contribute to the national security dialogue. And just thank you so much for coming today, for your presence at the conference, and also for this time today in the interview.
My pleasure, and thank your team for me, because it's been fantastic.
Excellent. Appreciate it. So that wraps it up. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Global National Security Institute's Speaker Series. We'll see you next time.